He invited her to watch him win, just to remind her she had already lost. The ballroom shimmered in gold and glass, a skyline view stretching beyond floor-to-ceiling windows where the city pulsed like a living thing beneath Manhattan's midnight haze. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Blake, tailored in a charcoal suit that fit like success itself, one hand resting lightly on a champagne flute, the other casually draped at his side, as if the entire evening had been designed to orbit him, which, in truth, it had. Investors murmured, cameras flashed softly, and somewhere near the entrance, Naomi Carter stepped inside without announcement, without hesitation, her heels striking the marble floor in a quiet, measured rhythm that didn't ask for attention yet somehow pulled it anyway, a black dress falling clean and precise against her frame. No excess, no apology, just presence. No one greeted her, not at first, but a few heads turned, not in recognition, but in curiosity, like sensing something familiar they couldn't quite place. And then Ethan saw her, his expression pausing for just half a second before reshaping into something almost amused, like spotting an old headline he thought had long been forgotten. "Naomi," he said, not loudly, but enough for those closest to hear, enough for the ripple to begin. "I didn't think you'd actually come." And there it was, the tone, polished but edged, the same one he used years ago when he started closing doors instead of opening them. When her name became something he stepped past rather than stood beside. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze moving past him, taking in the room, the investors, the long table where contracts waited under soft light, the subtle choreography of power playing out in tailored suits and quiet nods. And then back to him, steady, unreadable. "You sent an invitation," she replied simply, her voice even, neither warm nor cold, just present, and a soft chuckle slipped from someone nearby, the kind that didn't quite belong but found its way in anyway, encouraged by Ethan's slight smile. "I suppose I did," he said, lifting his glass slightly as if to toast his own generosity, "though I assumed you'd have better things to do these days," the words landing lightly but carrying weight beneath them, the implication hanging in the air like perfume too expensive to ignore. Naomi's posture didn't shift, not a single muscle betraying reaction, her hands relaxed at her sides, her shoulders squared not in defiance, but in quiet alignment, as if she had already decided long before stepping into this room exactly how this moment would unfold. Around them, the conversation resumed in fragments, whispers threading through the crowd, some recognizing her now, others piecing it together. She was the ex-wife, the one from before, the one who had been there when there was nothing but ambition and borrowed offices and late nights that smelled like cheap coffee and risk. Ethan turned slightly, gesturing toward the room as if presenting a finished product. "Things have changed," he said, almost casually, though the statement carried the sharp edge of intention, and for a brief moment, the city lights reflected in the glass behind him seemed to frame him like a portrait of everything he had become. Naomi followed the gesture with her eyes, not impressed, not intimidated, simply observing. And somewhere deep in the room, a server passed with a tray of champagne, the faint clink of glass punctuating the silence that settled between them. "They have," she said, her voice soft enough that only he could fully catch it, and yet it carried a certainty that didn't ask to be heard by anyone else. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her now, as if searching for cracks, for signs of the past still clinging to her, for anything that would confirm the version of her he had already decided existed. But what he found instead was something quieter, something steadier, something that didn't reach for validation or react to provocation. Across the room, the contracts waited, untouched for now, their presence subtle but significant, and Naomi's gaze drifted toward them for just a fraction of a second before returning to Ethan, a movement so small it could have been missed, except it wasn't, not entirely. "Well," he said, clearing his throat lightly, as if resetting the moment back into his control. "Enjoy the show." And with that, he turned slightly, rejoining the circle of investors who leaned in closer, their attention snapping back to him as if pulled by gravity. Naomi remained where she was, alone in the center of a room that had once been her future and was now something else entirely. The hum of conversation rising around her, the city lights flickering beyond the glass, and beneath it all, something unspoken, something patient, something already in motion, because she hadn't come to remember what she lost. She had come because there was something here that still belonged to her, and tonight, whether anyone realized it or not, was the night it would begin to return. The first time she signed her name for him, it was not on a contract that made headlines, but on a quiet document no one else in the room had cared to read. Back when the office was barely more than 800 square feet above a laundromat in Queens, and the heat clicked louder than the conversations they were trying to have. When Ethan still wore shirts that did not quite fit his shoulders and ambition that stretched far beyond them. And Naomi sat across from him with a pen balanced between her fingers, listening as he explained projections that sounded more like belief than certainty. His voice filled with that restless energy that once made her think the future was something they were building together instead of something he would eventually claim alone. She remembered the smell of burnt coffee that lingered in the air, the stack of unpaid invoices pushed to the corner of the desk, the way he had looked at her not as someone to impress, but as someone he trusted, and how that trust had felt heavier than any promise he could have spoken out loud. "It is just temporary," he had said back then, sliding the paper toward her, his tone soft, persuasive, almost careful. "I need your name on this while things are still unstable, just until everything is secure." And she had not hesitated, not because she did not understand the risk, but because she believed in the version of him that existed in that moment. The one who reached for her hand after long days and whispered plans that sounded like blueprints for a life they would share. The pen had touched the paper, her signature smooth and deliberate. Naomi Carter written in full, as if it were not just a name, but a foundation being placed beneath something invisible. Outside, a delivery truck had rattled past, the windows trembling slightly, and Ethan had smiled in a way that made everything feel possible, leaning back in his chair as if the hardest part had already been done. That was the first document, but it was not the last. There were others, each one framed as another step forward, another temporary measure, another piece of strategy that required her presence but never her spotlight. And each time, she signed, not out of blind loyalty, but out of a quiet certainty that what they were building had room for both of them. Until one day, it did not. The transition had not been loud. No single moment marked the shift, just a gradual change in tone, in language, in the way meetings happened without her, in the way decisions were explained instead of discussed, and eventually, in the way her name stopped appearing where it once had, replaced by structures she was told not to worry about, by reassurances that sounded increasingly like distance. The final conversation had taken place in a glass office that overlooked the same city now glowing beyond the ballroom windows. Only then it had felt colder, the skyline less like a promise and more like something already owned. "It is cleaner this way," Ethan had said, his voice steady, professional, as if he were explaining a business adjustment rather than unraveling a life. "You do not need to be tied to all of this anymore." And Naomi had watched him as he spoke, not interrupting, not arguing, just noticing the absence of the man who once needed her signature to begin anything at all. She had walked out with nothing in her hands, no documents, no claims, no argument left to make, just the quiet understanding that something had been taken, not by force, but by assumption. Back in the present, the ballroom light reflected faintly against the polished surface of the long table where new contracts waited, their edges perfectly aligned, their significance hidden beneath the simplicity of ink and paper, and Naomi's gaze settled there again, just for a moment, long enough to remember exactly how many times her name had already shaped what Ethan now believed he fully owned, long enough to recognize that what had once been signed away had never truly disappeared. It had only been waiting, preserved in places he had stopped looking, in structures he thought he controlled, in details he had overlooked because he no longer believed she was part of the equation. Across the room, Ethan's voice rose slightly as he addressed a group of investors, confident, assured, unaware that the foundation beneath him had never been entirely his to begin with. And Naomi stood still, the memory of ink drying on paper lingering somewhere beneath the calm surface of her expression, because this night was not about reclaiming what she had lost. It was about revealing what had never actually left her name in the first place. There was a moment when silence became louder than anything in the room, and it did not come from what was said, but from what Naomi chose not to respond to. Across the ballroom, laughter rose again, sharper this time, carried by a group of junior partners who had gathered closer to Ethan, their confidence borrowed from his presence. Their glances drifting toward her with the kind of curiosity that slowly turns into judgment when it is not corrected. One of them, a woman in a pale blue dress, with a voice just loud enough to be overheard, leaned slightly toward another and said, "I heard she used to be part of this, back before things became serious." And the phrase lingered in the air, light but dismissive, as if Naomi's past had been nothing more than a footnote in a story that had already moved on without her. Ethan did not stop it, did not redirect it. He simply allowed it to exist, his silence acting as permission, his faint smile as confirmation. Naomi heard every word, not because they were meant for her, but because they were not, and that made them louder, clearer, impossible to ignore. Yet her expression did not shift, her posture did not tighten. She did not step forward or step away, she remained exactly where she was, as if rooted not in the room, but in something far deeper than the moment unfolding around her. A server approached, offering a glass of sparkling water, and she accepted it with a quiet nod, her fingers steady, the cool condensation against the glass grounding in a way that required no reaction, no defense. The music shifted subtly, a slower rhythm weaving through the background, and the lights dimmed just enough to draw attention toward the front of the room where the long table waited, where the contract still lay untouched, where the next phase of the evening would soon begin. Ethan stepped forward then, his voice rising above the crowd with practiced ease, thanking everyone for their presence, speaking about growth, about vision, about the future in terms that sounded both expansive and controlled, each word placed carefully, each pause measured, and as he spoke, the room leaned in, the attention consolidating around him like a spotlight tightening its focus. Naomi watched, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who recognized every cadence, every strategic pause, every calculated shift in tone, because she had once been the one who heard these speeches before they were spoken, who understood the structure beneath the performance, who knew where confidence ended and dependency began. A few people closer to her began to move away subtly, not wanting to be associated, not wanting to stand too near someone whose relevance they could not define, and the space around her widened, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, enough to mark her as separate without anyone having to say it out loud. Still, she did not move, her gaze drifting once more toward the table, toward the stack of documents that now seemed to carry a quiet gravity, as if they were waiting for a moment that had not yet been announced. Ethan's speech reached its peak, his voice lifting slightly as he spoke about control, about securing the company's future through decisive action, about ownership as the ultimate measure of success. And there it was, the word itself, ownership, spoken with certainty, with pride, with the kind of finality that suggested there was nothing left to question. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing a line that had just been crossed, a claim that had just been made in a room full of witnesses. When she looked up again, there was no change in her expression, no visible shift, but something had settled into place beneath the surface, something quiet and irreversible, across the room. Ethan finished speaking to a wave of polite applause, stepping back slightly as the attention began to disperse, his confidence intact, his narrative unchallenged, and for a moment, everything appeared exactly as he intended it to be. But Naomi did not clap, did not join the movement of the crowd, did not follow the rhythm of approval that filled the space around her. She simply stood there, still and composed, holding a glass she had not yet sipped from, her presence unannounced yet undeniable. Because while the room believed it had already witnessed the height of the evening, Naomi knew something they did not, that this was not the moment where power was proven. This was only the moment where it was claimed, and claims, as she had learned long ago, were not the same as truth. The night she walked away, there was no audience, no applause, no dramatic final words echoing through a room that would remember her exit, just the quiet sound of a door closing behind her and the distant hum of traffic filtering up from the street 16 floors below. And for a while, that was all there was, silence that did not comfort, but did not accuse either, just space. wide and unfamiliar, stretching into days that no longer followed the rhythm of someone else's ambition. The apartment she moved into months later was small, barely 600 square feet on the edge of Brooklyn, with windows that faced a brick wall instead of a skyline, and mornings that arrived without urgency, without meetings to prepare for, without a voice calling her name from another room. She learned the weight of her own schedule again, the way time could feel both empty and entirely hers. How a cup of coffee tasted different when it was not rushed between conversations about projections and investors. How the quiet could become something steady instead of something that needed to be filled. The first job she took was not impressive, not something that would be mentioned in rooms like the one she stood in now. Just a position at a mid-sized financial services firm where her name did not carry history and her presence did not invite questions. And that was exactly what she needed, a place where she could move without explanation, where her past did not define the terms of her present. She sat in a cubicle that measured maybe 5 feet by 5 feet, a single monitor glowing in front of her, spreadsheets stretching across the screen in lines that demanded attention but offered no recognition. And she leaned into it, not because it was easy, but because it was precise, because numbers did not assume, did not dismiss, did not rewrite themselves based on who controlled the narrative. Late nights became routine again, but different this time, not driven by someone else's urgency, but by her own decision to understand what had once been kept just out of reach. She studied contracts not as supporting documents, but as structures, learned how ownership could shift not through declarations, but through clauses, through timing, through the quiet details that most people overlooked because they trusted the headline more than the fine print. Outside, the city moved through its seasons, summer heat pressing against the windows, fall air sharpening the edges of each day, winter settling in, with a stillness that made everything feel suspended. And through it all, Naomi remained consistent, her routine simple but intentional, mornings that began early, nights that stretched long, weekends that did not offer rest so much as focus. There were moments when memory tried to return, when a familiar phrase or a passing reflection brought Ethan's voice back into the edges of her mind. But she did not dwell there, did not revisit what had already been understood. She let it pass the way one lets noise fade into the background, acknowledged but not followed. Slowly, almost without noticing, her role began to shift, small responsibilities becoming larger ones, her insights no longer confined to her own desk, but requested in meetings, her name appearing in places it had not before, not as a favor, not as an extension of someone else's vision, but as a result of what she consistently delivered. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, she remained at her desk, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light over the papers in front of her, a contract laid open, its language familiar in a way that felt almost like recognition. And as she traced a line of text with her eyes, something settled into place, not a realization that arrived suddenly, but one that had been forming quietly over time, that everything she was learning now, everything she was building piece by piece, was not separate from what had come before. It was connected. It was continuation. It was the part of the story that had never been given space to unfold. She leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under the shift, and looked at her reflection in the darkened window, not searching for who she used to be, not measuring herself against what had been lost, but simply seeing what was there now, steady, composed, and no longer waiting for permission to exist in rooms she once helped build. Back in the present, the ballroom lights shimmered against the glass, the city still alive beyond it, and Naomi stood where she had been all along, the past no longer something that followed her, but something she carried with clarity. Because this time, every step she had taken, every line she had read, every decision she had made, had been entirely her own, and that difference, quiet as it was the beginning of something Ethan had never learned to see coming. It was not a single moment that changed everything, but a pattern she began to notice, small inconsistencies buried inside reports that no one else seemed interested in questioning, numbers that aligned too perfectly on the surface, yet shifted subtly beneath closer inspection. And Naomi learned to follow those shifts the way others followed headlines, quietly, patiently, without announcing what she was looking for. At the firm, her role had grown just enough to grant her access, not power, not yet, but visibility into structures that most employees accepted without challenge, and she used that access carefully, never drawing attention, never pushing too hard, simply observing, connecting, understanding. One afternoon, as late sunlight stretched across her desk in thin lines of gold, she found herself reviewing a portfolio tied to a series of shell entities. Their names generic, their ownership layered, but something about the pattern felt familiar, not in a way that sparked immediate recognition, but in a way that lingered, like a word she had once known but could not yet recall. She leaned closer to the screen, scrolling slowly, tracing the movement of assets from one entity to another, watching how control shifted without appearing to, how influence could be maintained even when ownership seemed to disappear. And then she saw it. A structure that mirrored something she had signed years ago, not identical, but close enough to echo, close enough to suggest intention. Her hand stilled on the mouse, her breathing steady, as the memory surfaced not as emotion, but as clarity. The quiet office, the stack of documents, Ethan's voice explaining temporary measures that had never truly been temporary. She did not react outwardly, did not call attention to what she had found. Instead, she opened another file, then another, building a map in her mind, connecting entities, timelines, decisions, until the picture began to take shape. And what it revealed was not a mistake, not an oversight, but a system. One designed to consolidate control while appearing distributed, one that depended on assumptions remaining unchallenged. Over the following weeks, Naomi returned to those files whenever she could, fitting the work into her schedule without disrupting it, her focus precise, her approach disciplined, and slowly, the pattern became undeniable, a network that led back to one central point, one name that did not appear directly, but influenced everything beneath it. She did not need to see it written to know who it was. The structure itself carried his signature more clearly than any document ever could. Still, she waited, because understanding was only the first step. Timing mattered, positioning mattered, and she had learned long ago that moving too soon could erase everything she was trying to build. It was during one of those late evenings, when the office had emptied and the city outside had softened into a distant glow, that someone else noticed her still working. A man standing near the doorway of the conference room she had moved into for more space, his presence quiet but not hesitant. "You are either very dedicated," he said, his voice calm, measured, "or you have found something worth staying for." And Naomi looked up, meeting his gaze without surprise, as if she had expected someone like him to appear eventually, someone who did not interrupt the silence, but understood it. He stepped inside slowly, his posture relaxed, his suit understated in a way that suggested confidence without display, and he did not ask what she was doing, did not lean over her shoulder or reach for the papers. He simply observed, giving her the space to decide what to reveal. "Sometimes," she replied after a moment, her tone even, "those are the same thing." And he nodded slightly, as if the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Alexander Reed. He introduced himself, not with emphasis, not expecting recognition, just stating it as fact, and Naomi returned the acknowledgement with a small nod, her attention returning briefly to the documents in front of her before lifting again, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharpened. He glanced toward the screen, not intruding, but noticing enough to understand the direction of her work, and there was a pause, not empty, but filled with the quiet recognition that neither of them needed to explain what was unfolding. "Most people look at numbers and see results," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "You look at them and see control." And Naomi did not smile, did not deflect. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then closed the file with a soft click, as if sealing something that was not yet ready to be opened. "Results change," she said, her voice steady. "Control does not. Not unless someone knows where to look." And Alexander's expression shifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, as if he had just confirmed that the person standing in front of him was not searching for opportunity, but already standing on the edge of it. Back in the ballroom, Ethan's laughter carried again across the room, confident, unchallenged, the sound of someone who believed the structure beneath him was secure, and Naomi remained still, The memory of that quiet office and the man who had seen what others overlooked settling into place beside everything else she had learned. Because the difference now was not just what she knew, but who else understood it, and that changed the shape of what was about to come. Preparation did not announce itself with urgency. It settled in quietly, like a decision that had already been made long before anyone realized it was unfolding. And Naomi understood that what mattered now was not discovery, but execution, not what she knew, but how and when it would be revealed. In the weeks that followed her conversation with Alexander Reed, nothing about her routine appeared to change on the surface. She still arrived early, still left late, still moved through the office with the same measured pace that drew little attention. But beneath that consistency, something precise was taking shape, a sequence of steps aligned with intention rather than reaction. Alexander did not interrupt her process, did not attempt to lead or redirect. Instead, he positioned himself where access met influence, opening doors without announcing them, creating space without claiming credit. And when they spoke, it was never about what she had already uncovered. It was about timing, about structure, about the difference between having leverage and using it effectively. One evening, they sat across from each other in a quiet conference room. The city outside dimmed to reflections against the glass. A single document placed between them, its language dense but deliberate, every clause positioned with care, and Naomi read through it slowly, not because she needed time to understand, but because she respected what it represented, a consolidation of everything she had traced, every pattern she had followed, every assumption she had refused to accept. Once this is executed, Alexander said, his voice even, there is no reversal, no negotiation, no interpretation left to chance. And Naomi nodded slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, her expression unchanged, because she had already understood that long before this moment. She had learned that ownership was not declared in grand statements. It was secured in details, in the parts no one thought to challenge until it was too late. It was never his alone. She replied quietly, not as an argument, but as a fact that had been waiting for the right context to exist openly. And Alexander did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, but because he recognized that the statement did not need confirmation. The next phase unfolded without spectacle, signatures placed where they needed to be, approvals moving through channels that had been prepared in advance, entities shifting in alignment with agreements that had been structured to appear routine. And through it all, Naomi remained consistent, her presence steady, her involvement precise but never overstated. No one questioned the process because it did not appear disruptive. It did not challenge the surface narrative. It moved within it, beneath it, until the structure itself began to realign. The invitation arrived days later, printed on thick paper, its design clean, understated, announcing a formal event that would mark the next stage of Ethan's company, a public confirmation of growth, of control, of everything he believed he had secured. And Naomi held it in her hands for a moment longer than necessary, not because it carried emotional weight, but because it represented the final piece of timing falling into place. She set it down on the table beside the documents she had already prepared, the contrast between them subtle but significant, one announcing a future, the other defining it. The night of the event approached without tension, without hesitation, her preparation simple, deliberate. A black dress selected not for attention, but for clarity, shoes placed beside the door, everything aligned with the same quiet precision that had guided her from the beginning. She did not rehearse what she would say because she already knew there would be very little to say. The moment itself would carry everything necessary. Back in the ballroom, the lights shimmered against glass and polished surfaces, conversations weaving through the air, Ethan moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. And Naomi stood where she had been before, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, yet entirely different in position. Because while nothing around her had visibly shifted, everything beneath it had already begun to move. And this time, when the moment arrived, it would not be claimed, it would be confirmed. The room shifted before anyone realized why. A subtle change in rhythm, like a conversation losing its balance for half a second before correcting itself. And it began not with a voice, but with a presence moving toward the center of the space with quiet certainty. Ethan had just finished another round of introductions, his tone light, confident, the kind of ease that comes from believing every outcome has already been secured, when his attention caught on something just beyond the circle of investors, something that did not belong to the flow he had been controlling all night. Naomi stepped forward, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded space, but in a way that made space naturally, her movement steady, unhurried, her gaze level as it met his without invitation or hesitation. A few conversations nearby softened, not silenced, but lowered, as if the room itself sensed a shift that had not yet been explained. Ethan smiled, the same practiced expression he had used earlier, though. This time it carried a sharper edge, a need to re-establish the tone before it changed without his consent. "I see you are still here," he said, his voice just loud enough to draw attention back toward him, to frame the moment before it could define itself. "I was not sure how long you would stay." And a few people around them glanced between the two, curiosity beginning to replace indifference. Naomi did not answer immediately, her eyes resting on him with a calm that did not challenge, but did not yield either. And in that pause, something unspoken stretched between them, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Ethan continued, filling the silence before it could settle too deeply. "These events can be overwhelming, especially if you are not used to them anymore." The words delivered lightly, almost considerate on the surface, but carrying the same quiet dismissal that had followed her since she arrived. A faint ripple of polite laughter moved through the group, not strong enough to dominate the room, but enough to reinforce the line he was drawing. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the movement minimal, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice remained even, measured. "I am exactly where I need to be." And the simplicity of the statement landed without force, without emphasis, yet it lingered in a way that made the air feel just slightly heavier. Ethan's smile held, but something behind it tightened, a fraction of a second where control felt less certain than before, and he responded quickly, as if to smooth over what did not need to be addressed. "Of course you are," he said, gesturing casually toward the table at the front of the room. "Tonight is about moving forward, about securing what comes next, something we have all worked very hard to achieve." His emphasis subtle, but clear enough to frame ownership once again, to remind the room who stood at the center of it. Naomi followed the gesture with her eyes, her gaze settling briefly on the documents waiting under the soft light, then returning to him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them filled not with tension, but with awareness. Around them, more people had begun to notice, their conversations slowing, their attention shifting in quiet increments, drawn not by volume, but by stillness, by the sense that something was about to unfold without being announced. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, reclaiming the focus with a small movement of his shoulders, his confidence reasserting itself as he addressed those closest to him. "We will be finalizing everything shortly," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "And I think you will all be very pleased with the direction we are taking." And as he spoke, he glanced once more at Naomi, not directly, but enough to acknowledge her presence without granting it significance. Naomi did not move, did not interrupt, did not attempt to redirect the moment. She simply remained where she was, her silence no longer passive, but deliberate, her stillness no longer unnoticed, because while Ethan continued to speak, continued to frame the narrative as his own, the room had already begun to feel the shift, subtle, but undeniable, the kind that does not arrive with noise, but with certainty. And somewhere beneath the surface of polished words and practiced confidence, the structure he relied on was already beginning to reveal the truth he had not prepared for, that this time, the moment unfolding in front of him was not one he controlled, but one he was about to witness. The shift did not arrive with a raised voice or a dramatic interruption. It came through something far quieter, the kind of movement that does not ask for attention but commands it anyway. As the doors near the far end of the ballroom opened, and a man stepped inside with the ease of someone who did not need to be announced, his presence subtle yet undeniable, his suit tailored in a way that spoke of precision rather than display. And those who recognized him did not react loudly, they simply adjusted, conversations pausing mid-sentence, posture straightening, attention recalibrating without instruction. Alexander Reed did not hurry, did not scan the room for approval. He moved forward with a calm that suggested everything unfolding had already been accounted for. And as he approached the center of the room, the ripple of recognition spread further. Investors who had been leaning toward Ethan now shifting their focus. Not abruptly, but enough to be felt. Ethan noticed it, of course. He did, the slight change in alignment. The way attention was no longer anchored entirely to him. And for a brief moment, something unreadable crossed his expression before it settled back into composure. "Alexander," he said, stepping forward with a measured smile, extending his hand in a gesture that balanced familiarity and calculation. "I was not aware you would be joining us tonight." His tone smooth, controlled, but carrying the faintest edge of uncertainty beneath it. Alexander accepted the handshake without hesitation, his grip firm but not dominant, his expression neutral, as if this encounter was neither unexpected nor particularly significant to him. "There are moments worth attending," he replied simply, his voice even, his gaze steady, and he did not elaborate further, did not fill the space with explanation, allowing the weight of his presence to speak where words did not. For a second, the room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation of conflict, but in recognition that something had shifted beyond the visible surface. Ethan released the handshake with a small nod, turning slightly as if to reassert the flow of the evening. "Well, you are just in time," he said, gesturing toward the table where the contracts awaited. "We are about to finalize the next phase," his voice regaining its earlier confidence, though the edges now felt more deliberate, more constructed. Alexander's gaze followed the gesture briefly, then moved past it, settling not on the documents, but on Naomi, who had not moved from where she stood, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and in that single, quiet moment, the connection between them became visible without being announced. He stepped toward her, not with urgency, not with display, but with intention, closing the distance as if it had always been part of the path he was following. "Naomi," he said, her name spoken without emphasis, without surprise, simply acknowledged, and she met his gaze with the same steady composure, as if this moment had already been lived in her mind long before it arrived in reality. Around them, the room adjusted again, attention narrowing, conversations fading into the background as the alignment of presence and focus shifted in a way that no longer centered Ethan, but redefined the space entirely. Ethan watched, his expression controlled, but his stillness more rigid now, as if he were recalculating in real time, measuring variables that had not been part of his original design. Alexander turned slightly, his position now beside Naomi rather than across from her, and when he spoke next, it was not to her alone, but to the room, his voice carrying just enough to reach those closest, and then those beyond them. "Before anything is finalized," he said, his tone calm, precise, "there is a detail that should be clarified," and he paused, not for effect, but because the moment required no rush, because certainty does not need to be accelerated. A subtle movement followed as a legal representative near the table straightened, documents being adjusted. A folder opened with quiet efficiency, and the room, once filled with layered conversations and overlapping intentions, now focused on a single point of unfolding clarity. Naomi did not speak, did not step forward. She simply remained where she was, her presence aligned with the moment without needing to claim it, because everything that needed to be said had already been prepared, not in words, but in structure, in signatures, in timing. Ethan's gaze moved between them, then toward the table, then back again, and for the first time that evening, his confidence did not expand to fill the room. It held in place, contained, as if waiting for confirmation that had not yet arrived. And as the documents were positioned, as the quiet machinery of legality began to move into visibility, the truth that had been building beneath the surface all night finally approached the edge of being seen, not as a challenge, not as a disruption, but as a fact that had been present long before anyone in the room thought to question it. The room did not erupt. It did not fracture into chaos or disbelief. It simply stilled, as if every sound had been quietly pulled out from under it, leaving only the soft rustle of paper as the legal representative began to read, his voice steady, precise, carrying across the space without needing to rise. each word landing with the weight of something already decided long before this moment. Ethan stood where he was, his posture held in place by habit rather than certainty, his gaze fixed on the documents as if clarity might shift if he looked long enough. But it did not. It only settled further, each clause confirming what had been carefully constructed beneath the surface, each line connecting the past he had dismissed to the present he no longer controlled. Primary controlling interest, the representative stated, pausing only briefly before continuing. Assigned under prior binding agreements and consolidated through subsequent acquisitions. And then the name, spoken without emphasis, without ceremony, yet echoing through the room with unmistakable finality. Naomi Carter. There was no immediate reaction, no audible gasp, just a collective stillness that deepened as understanding moved through the crowd, slow but certain, like a tide that could not be reversed once it had begun. Ethan's expression did not collapse. It did not break into visible shock. It simply narrowed, the confidence that had filled it moments ago receding into something more contained, more measured, as if he were attempting to locate the exact point where control had slipped without ever announcing its departure. He looked at Naomi then, not with anger, not even with accusation, but with a question he did not voice, because the answer was already being read aloud in front of him. Naomi met his gaze for a brief moment, not long enough to invite conversation, just enough to acknowledge the space between what had been and what now existed, and in that glance, there was no triumph, no need to prove anything further, only clarity. Alexander remained beside her, his presence unchanged, neither forward nor withdrawn, as if his role had always been to stand at the edge of the moment rather than at its center, and when the reading concluded, he did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to settle into something complete, something that required no reinforcement. Around them, the investors shifted subtly, their attention recalibrating, conversations beginning again but quieter now, more deliberate, as if the room itself had adjusted its understanding of where authority truly resided. The documents were placed on the table with quiet finality, their significance no longer abstract, no longer hidden beneath structure, but visible in a way that could not be reinterpreted. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled release, rather than a reaction, and stepped back half a pace, not as a retreat, but as an acknowledgement that the space he had occupied no longer belonged to him in the same way, his voice absent where it had once defined the room. Naomi did not move toward the table immediately. She did not reach for the documents or claim the center of attention. She simply stood where she was, allowing the moment to exist without interference. Because nothing about it required her to assert control, it was already established. After a brief pause, she stepped forward, her movement quiet, unhurried, the sound of her heels against the floor measured and steady, and as she reached the table, she placed her hand lightly against the edge, not gripping, not claiming, just resting there, as if confirming something that had long been hers. She did not look back at Ethan, did not address the room, did not deliver a statement designed to define what had just occurred. Instead, she allowed the silence to hold its meaning, because words would have reduced it to something smaller than it was. The city lights beyond the glass reflected against the polished surface, casting faint patterns that shifted with every subtle movement. And in that reflection, Naomi's figure remained steady, composed, unchanged by the attention now settling around her. After a moment, she turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the exit, not as an escape, but as a continuation, and without hesitation, she stepped away from the table, from the center, from the narrative that had once excluded her, leaving behind a room that no longer needed explanation to understand what had just been revealed. She did not win him back. She did not return to reclaim what had been lost. She moved forward with something far quieter, far more complete, the certainty that what she had built had never truly been taken, only overlooked, and now, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, she had made it visible again.